right, we're gonna talk a little bit about the state of Decoupled Drupal. So are we there yet? I'm gonna give it away right away. We are there, it works, but in a way we're not there because maybe it's not known enough, so we'll try to figure out why. Hi everyone, my name is Simon. I work for Evolving Web. It's a full service agency that you might already know. If you don't, we're just in the hallway. We have a booth, come and chat with us. We're doing almost everything that revolves around building Drupal projects, mainly from like the actual development, but also strategy and design. Also have a training offering. We're working with a lot of higher head clients, public sector, governments. That's kind of the bulk of it. I'm the Director of Technology, which means I'm herding a bunch of assets, sorry, I'm managing a team of developers, trying to make sure that we do the project in the most sound way, if you what else can I say? Well, I started my journey with Drupal around 2008, and I built my first Decoupled project in 2008. So, anyone want to take a guess at which Drupal version that was back then?
5?
It was 6. I wish it would. It had been 5. So Drupal 6. Back then, what do you think the front-end technology was used in front of that Drupal 6 backend? And if you went to the training yesterday, don't answer because you know the answer. Front-end technology.
Backbone.
What?
Backbone.
That would have been a good answer. That was like, it's pretty spot on in terms of chronology, Backbone.js, but it was not actually really a web technology. Adobe Flash, anyone? Yeah, that's right. Now it's just to say that it's not really new. I mean, building decoupled architecture with Drupal is not really new. We've been doing that already for a long time. I'm just going to, so here's a quick word about our team. That's our office is in Montreal. We're going to move pretty soon, so we'll have to update that slide. We're traveling a lot to conferences. That's the team that's here at MidConf. So Rich, my associate director of technology, is with us, and Ankush is also here. So feel free to come by the booth. I'm just going to plug that in here. If you enjoy that kind of conferences, we're setting up one new edition of our Evolve Drupal series in Boston pretty soon. So just scan the QR code, go to evolvedrupal.com, or just go and chat with us if you want more details. So let's dive in. Let's speak about what decoupled is in general. So what's a decoupled architecture? Or headless architecture? Or decoupled architecture?
Decoupled.
What's the right word for that? Let's try to explain that a bit. So decoupled first. Decoupled is really about the architecture in itself. It's all about assembling different components to build something that's more like a distributed system, if you will. So usually that means instead of just using Drupal alone as a monolith to do everything, you can integrate that in an architecture where all the components are doing all the stuff. And that doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to use a different front end. That can mean that some aspect of the feature that Drupal would have be doing, you can offload that to a different component, even on the back end. So decoupled is more general in terms of like trying to use different components around Drupal. Headless really speak to the actual front-end side of things. If you look at Drupal as traditionally as a monolith, when you're using it alone to build a website, it's going to have a back-end and a front-end part. If you're building a decoupled architecture, when you swap Drupal's front-end for another front-end, that's where we speak about headless Drupal. So headless Drupal is actually using Drupal as a backend in in a decoupled architecture where the front end is done by another technology. So it's a decoupled solution with a headless CMS. So how does that work in practice? So usually, typically on the web, when you build a website, what's going to happen is you're going to have some server-side, kind of Drupal, WordPress, or whatever. It's going to serve web pages. It's going to serve HTML content to the browser that's going to display it. When you start doing decoupled work, you swap the front-end side from something that's more like an app that runs inside the browser, and instead of communicating with the server and get HTML, it's going to get data, usually in the form of a JSON payload. So, all in all, a decoupled Drupal architecture means you take a headless backend, you remove all the front-end side of things. It's going to do everything that Drupal does well, so content modding, all the CMS features, user management, permissions, everything that's basically stateful. It's going to store the state of your website. And you pick a separate web stack, a front-end stack, to do all that's on the front-end side of things. So it's going to fetch the data, it's going to present the data, it's going to do caching optimization. It's going to be basically stateless. All the actual state of the storage on the long-term is going to be, long-term stuff is going to be on the Drupal backend. And of course, you're going to have to pick an API that sits in between to have the data flow from the backend to the front end. That's interesting, but it really worth the trouble. And I don't know why. When you ask AI for a picture that's around Chicago, there's always like some bears that comes up for various reasons. I mean, it's my first time here. I don't know why. I'm happy to hear an explanation. So actual use cases, as I told you, I mean, I've been working with decoupled architecture for quite a while. So the actual use case I personally encounter are websites that I said that don't reload. So it's basically websites that are behave more like an application in your browser, which gives you the ability to do like animations, transitions, and more like reactive user experience. Also productivity apps. Like I have worked on M&A project management application for the financial world that happens to be like developed with Angular, and all the data management behind that app was actually a Drupal instance. No one knew, no one needed to know, but actually it saves us time because we didn't have to rebuild the whole database management and permission management and all that. We've been building web learning platforms with e-commerce integration, content delivery, desktop apps. So desktop apps like an app you actually install on your machine that provides service that work even if you're offline, and the backend is Drupal. And also like a content production platform where the content of training sessions or training decks were actually modeled as Drupal nodes with integration and exports with tools like After Effects, for example, just using Drupal as a backend because it's really good at translation, so that we were able to expose translation UIs to translators and then re-export the content back. So it's not just the Drupal website we make with React, it's way larger than that. Basically, to summarize, what we're going to get if we go for that kind of architecture is have a little bit more advanced UX, like something that you could do using Drupal frontend, but that you're going to have maybe some trouble integrating because like the frontend stack of Drupal is obviously a little bit opinionated and work in a specific way. You'll get better performance because you're able to basically end up with a completely static website in most cases. You don't rely on Drupal. That gives also the benefits of increased security, because in some cases you could even completely isolate the Drupal side of thing and make it completely not accessible from the internet, so you also lower the security risk on that end. The multiple channels is interesting because that means it gives you ability to store and manage your content in one place and reuse it across different channels or media, whether say a main website, but maybe screens at a specific physical location, or reuse it in emails or various places. For example, you might picture, let's say if you have a client that's a museum, they have a lot of content they want to display on their website, but maybe they also want to display that on linear screens display that's on site, or even interactive kiosk inside the actual museum, or even in multiple locations, and then that's interesting to be able to manage that content in just one place, especially if you have to translate that in multiple languages for your audience. Reinforcement of the content governance, because basically you decouple the content structure and the content management from the way it's actually displayed. The content edition team are going to take a more semantic look at the data rather than focusing on how it actually looks on the screen, which usually end up with content that's more that's going to last longer. That's more future-proof because you can more easily change the way the message is displayed on the screen. In a position where you have a CMS where you specifically place blocks of a specific size on the left, on the right, and that kind of things. Another important advantage is to leverage what you already have. That can be people, that happens to, I don't know, for example, know React, but you want to introduce better content management. You can introduce Drupal and keep an existing team that's going to develop the front end with React. You can also leverage some existing tools. For example, in large organizations, you might have a design system with an existing set of components that happens to be developed as a set of React components. In that case, if you want to build a website, it might be easier to just build the front end with React and plug it into a Drupal backend. And all that can be summarized in seeing that as a long-term investment in your backend, because once you decoupled the backend, the CMS, from the front end, that means you can more often evolve, change, or replace the front end stack while keeping your content and your data in your CMS, and you don't have to change everything at the same time. Another interesting aspect, and plugging in here, is everything that revolves around progressive web apps, which is like more like a marketing term to define all the nice features and API that are now provided by the web browsers, the web platform. And it ranges from being able to run features offline, so without any connection, or to leverage the features that the actual device provides, such as, I don't know, vibration of the phone, or being able to read QR codes, or I don't know, the device can act as an NFC tag. So all those features that are available on the devices that are exposed by the browser that you can leverage in your web app or websites are usually easier to implement with, let's say, a React app or a Vue.js app or Angular app, rather than that Drupal, which is basically a set of pages that are constantly refreshed. So let's dive into how we actually build that kind of projects in 4 easy steps. Looking at the content, the backend structure basically, connect that backend to the front end. Once it's connected, we build the application, and then we push the big red button and click live. Easy enough? So first thing is about the content architecture. If you never approached, let's say, decoupled Drupal architecture, the first thing to remember, you need to think about your content more semantically than visually. Usually, you need to leave aside, let's say, the WYSIWYG experience of editing content, and think about it more in terms of semantic blocks of what you're trying to communicate. But you're still going to get, right now with the advance of that whole site, you're still going to get some kind of a live preview of your content before publishing it, obviously within the context of the front-end app. But it's not going to be what you see is what you get kind of layout builder kind of experience. Hopefully that becomes false when Experience Builder starts being released, because Experience Builder being a React app, there might be actually a way to implement live editing in the front end, but that's for later. I would say personally that usually in those kind of architecture, if you're knowledgeable about the Drupal world, you know that usually we pick between the paragraphs world or the layout builder world to build the content model. Usually I would go with paragraphs, just because the way that the data is ultimately going to be exposed to the front-end app, if you use paragraphs, is way simpler than layout builder, even if both are possible. Which means if you already have a backend of an existing website that's built with layout builder and you're thinking of chopping the head, removing the template layer of the website and go to a more modern stack, you can still keep your content and leverage it in a React app. Now comes the big question. You're going to need to connect your CMS to your front-end stack. There's two major contenders. The only contenders, you could go crazy and build your own API, but the two choices are either JSON API or GraphQL. Frankly speaking, they're mostly, in terms of feature, they're equivalent. So there's no really a take on stuff you can do with one or stuff you can do only with the other. They can both access the data, provide listings, which is views of your content, fetching a specific content, a specific node, for example. And you can also craft some specific business logic that you want to invoke from your backend with both of them. And more on that, they can actually be complementary. So you can, for example, say choose to start with JSON API for some reason, but then end up having a specific feature that's easier to implement with GraphQL in terms of API integration and use them in parallel. One of the decision points that I'd like to put forward is the JSON API is part of Drupal core, GraphQL isn't, so it might look like an easier first step if you're discovering if you're entering the world of Decoupled Drupal for the first time. But GraphQL just works, and if you have a team of developers that's more used to that, that might actually be easier. So all in all, from where we're at right now, they're basically interchangeable. Now let's talk about. Now we have talked about the backend. We're providing an API. We're going to build an application, but then we're going to have to deploy it. The way you're going to work with that front-end application on your local development environment is vastly different from what you actually need to put in production on the production environment. So there's a lot of variations of subtleties in different deployment models, but it basically boils down to two families, if you will. The first is the original ones, where it all started, which is called the single-page application, which is basically your front end act as a JavaScript application that starts on the browser, execute codes, fetch data from Drupal, and displays the content on the screen. And the second one is the family of, let's say, static site generation. There's different terms, but it's easy to remember which is basically instead of having all of that running in the browser, we're going to find a way to run it on the server instead, so that we can deliver some kind of you can think of a pre-rendered page on the server, so the application starts right away, display the content, and then it behaves like a single-page application. There's variations of that from fully static generation, from you will find terms such as ISR, PPR, CSR, which is basically mean either if there's a content change in your CMS, you're going to either rebuild the whole application or just rebuild part of the application. That's just variations of those two main models. So now we've been looking at the big picture. Of course, we're going to have to pick which front-end stack we want to use. Anyone think there's missing options? Raise your hand if you feel like I need to add another option.
Svelte kit?
Yeah, we could. Happy to discuss. There's zillions of different versions. As I said, I started personally with Flash. There's you can use, I've heard a case, I do apologize if that person is in the room today. It was in the training yesterday about like the front-end technology of their project is actually another .NET application, so it can get what. Like what you see here is basically the usual. Is it React? Is it Vue.js? Is it Angular? Is it anything else? The reality right now, if you're getting started, is like there's one clear winner, in my opinion, which is in terms of popularity, community, existing resources, ways to get up and running quickly, just basically React, and then its derivatives. So right now, Next.js is, in my opinion, the easiest route to go based on React. The others we can debate. I mean, Astro is also a nice alternative. But really, for Next.js, you're going to get something that works, something that's well documented, and you're also going to get a ready-to-use integration with Drupal. So let's look. I'm going to just quickly show some examples of projects that we've been just building, like in the past few years. So that project for Princeton International, you can picture like everything from the top of the page to just right after the hero is a Drupal page, and then after that it's a React app. So it's kind of a progressive decoupling, if you will. And the reason we went that route is just the whole stuff is really behaving like an app. It's like a super complex, let's say, multi-step web form when a student can like, pick and choose between different courses and build their own journey, and then they can submit that on the server, which means building that as multiple steps with web form or even with the Drupal form API would have been first very tedious, and probably the UX would also have been a little bit less impressive or usable than what we have here. So more because of an advanced UX. The other one, the website we've built for Amazon Corp. That one is built with Vue.js, interestingly. It was pushed by the design agency, but it really looks and feels like an Next.js app. The reason we went decoupled is because the design team was really impressive animations and transition and content that, circles that grows and reveal the contents, and it's way easier to build with a decoupled application. And more recently, one website we built for Planned Parenthood to promote one of their new offering. And the reason we went decoupled for that, in that case specifically using Next.js, is for performance reasons and security reasons. Because you probably understand that they're touching like politically involved, like politically tainted topics, which means if they're featured in the news, they're going to get a lot of traffic. So they were willing to use a CMS, but basically rely on a fully static website. And also for security, because of the same reason, they might actually be hacked and some people might try to take them down. And once again, having a static website instead of an exposed dynamic CMS makes the websites virtually unhackable, basically. So now that we've seen the capabilities and how it like works at a high level, I'm going to look into more like specific details of the implementation, just to basically outline how easy it got. So that's what I like to call like the shopping list of what we need to provide in order to build a website, and some specifics about the fact that the website is actually going to be decoupled. What's interesting is, how's the list actually going to be right away crossed out? Because Drupal already provides all of that. So we're going to basically focus on right now like how technically we can make a decoupled frontend, like basically a separate app, understand how to manipulate Drupal content, so to understand content that's basically identified by a URL that is under the control of the content editor, and how it displays that on the screen. In terms of content modeling, there's nothing specific about the fact that it's decoupled. It's the usual, you build your content types in Drupal, then Drupal is going to manage the Drupal config, so for each content type there's going to be a YAML file. Those are the nitty-gritty technical details, but basically that's handled for you. And on the front-end side, React developers are just going to build React components, more or less one per content type, if you will. Those are going to be the template page, and like if there's more, because there are some variations depending on the use case of a specific data. But basically, that means it's very, very similar to just basically crafting twig templates. Then, if you're going the paragraph way to build your landing pages, basically that's kind of the same. You're going to create your paragraphs. That's all the components you want to put on your pages. Same story. Drupal is going to handle all the config aspect, and nothing changes from a regular website. And on the React side of things, same thing. The developers are going to implement all those like components as React components, which is very similar to what we would have been doing with just with templates, right? But then once we have all of that, once we have the capabilities of modeling the content on the back end and expressing components and templates on the front end, how do we wire that up together? So if we take just an example URL, that's an actual one, that's live. We're going to ask the front end, the React app, to render the page that is behind that URL. The problem is a URL in the Drupal world doesn't mean anything in itself. It's an arbitrary string of characters that the content editor can choose to associate to their page. That's basically an alias for what is it. In that case, it's a node, and the ID of the node is happens to be 43. But even more, like to add even an additional layer of complexity, when we're usually when we're building decoupled app, we're not going to retrieve the content based on numerical IDs. We're going to use the content UUIDs, which is something that when we do usual Drupal stuff, we rarely touch UUIDs, but when we start integrating Drupal with other stuff, that's actually the preferred way to go, which means when the front-end app is going to be willing to retrieve content from the backend, it's actually going to have to issue a request that involves the UUID of the page, not the actual node ID that we usually interact with. Once the front-end app is going to have discovered the UUID and loaded, it's going to retrieve the data of the page as a JSON payload that, like, it's unreadable on the screen, but that's fine because as a developer, you don't actually need to interact directly with that. And it's going to render the components on the page. But how do we actually do that kind of work that looks like resolving a DNS name to an IP address, basically? Thankfully, there's a module that does that, that does exactly that job. That's part of all the major decoupled Drupal starter kits. That the front end is just going to pass the actual URL, so just the path, in that case /post, and that specific API endpoint is going to return what is actually behind that URL, and that's how the front end is going to discover what is behind any arbitrary URL. In that case, I don't know if I can point. Yeah, I can point. The type of the content and its UUID, which allows the front end to build the actual API code. Then there are some stuff around the content. And as an example, I'm going to take the example of the menus. So in your case, it might start small. It might be just a small decoupled front end with just a handful of main menu items. But I would strongly discourage from hard coding those items in the front end app, because no developer wants to be distracted from their next project. Just go back and add an additional menu item in an existing app, especially when we all know that Drupal is capable of handling a hierarchy of many items, and it's possible to actually expose them through the API. So the way it works is like with that JSON API menu items, if you're working with JSON API, with JSON equivalent, you're going to be able to allow your content editors to manage menus in just the way they're used to do, expose that to the app, and React developers are going to be able to render that menu on the screen. Then what happens, obviously, what that provides, obviously, is if that needs to be changed, even if it's a simple like swap two items, like change the order, no developer is actually required to. No developer work is actually required to do that kind of change. One of the major, like over the years, one of the major source of complexity around decoupled architecture was about how do you actually preview your content, how do you actually make sure it looks okay before going live. Now it went a long way, and it's actually possible that the screen is a little bit bright, but basically what we have here on the screen is the typical Drupal page for a node where you can find the usual edit and delete revisions tab. But what you see is thanks to the Drupal next module, we are able to swap the usual view tab that would usually render the page, that would actually be the page that the visitors would see, to something that actually embeds the front-end app in an iframe. And that page becomes like that. View tab is actually only accessible to content editors and required to be authenticated. And it also works with unpublished content or unpublished revisions of a content, which means it's possible to load up the app and display content that's not yet published or an upcoming revision in order to check it. Now that we lined up all the pieces and we're ready to go, the final step is to actually build the front end so it's so it can be deployed to production and consumed by actual visitors. If we're in the Next.js world, so it will vary if you're using Vue.js or Angular or whatever, but the framework is going to usually provide you with a command like a CLI tool that is going to do all the build stuff. And the build stuff means optimizing the JavaScript, minifying the CSS, packaging everything. And in the case of the Next.js app that works with Drupal, also fetching all the pages that you want to have in your website, extracting that from Drupal, packaging it with the app, so that everything is, let's say, statified and deployed statically to a hosting provider. So as I said, it's a command line app, a command line command, and obviously you're not going to ask content editors when they're done changing content on the website to open a terminal and run a CLI command. So there's an integration layer with the deploy hooks module that basically allows to expose just a simple button in the Drupal UI so that it's possible to trigger the rebuild of the app whenever it's required. And the way it looks like, it looks like so the actual button is what's at the bottom of the screen, which is like, okay, I want to recreate the app, rebuild it, and deploy it to the live environment in that case. But it also keeps track of all the content that was changed, so nodes and paragraphs and everything, since the last deployment to that specific environment, which means when someone wants to deploy, they can actually go, and if they want, check all those pages via the preview tab that we just saw to make sure that everything's okay before actually hitting the button. So basically, if we summarize what we all see, what we just seen seems like a lot of parts to piece together and a lot of like technical requirements. There's, like I mentioned, a few dependencies. It happens like when you actually install the Drupal next module, most of those other modules are actually dependencies of the Drupal next module, so they're gonna already be there. And you might wonder what's the extent of the custom code that a developer is going to have to write around those like building blocks in order to make that happen. In reality, right now, today, it's actually known. there's like the two projects, the Planned Parenthood project and the Angle project I showed you previously. There's no Drupal custom code. So right away, right now, if you deploy a Drupal backend with that set of components, you're capable of building a front end using React or Vue.js without having to write any custom code. Of course, there'll always be some specifics. If, for example, you have to migrate data or you have to integrate with different third-party services, you might have to write some custom code. But for the basics that we just outlined, there's no need. A couple of pointers to where you can learn more about everything we just discussed. But even if all of that looks super appealing and easy, there's a secret, which I'm only revealing to my favorite people. But I mean, if you went here today at 9 a.m. to attend my session, you're definitely part of my favorite people. So I'm going to tell you my secret, which is the headless equation. One project equals two projects. So that's an important take because it will, even if it's easy, always take a little bit more time than just doing that with Drupal alone, especially if it's your first attempt. Oh, I have another secret. There's no need for custom modules, as we just said. So I think we can probably say as a community that with Drupal, we are in possession of a no-code headless CMS, which means we're playing against the major contenders out there, the commercial offerings such as Contentful and the likes that are like claims to be no-code offering and ready-to-go solutions. We have the same thing as an open source viable alternative. That said, I went and I asked a few GPTs, what are the top 10 recommended headless CMS in 2025? What's Drupal, right? Well, so I was, of course, I mean, as a major proponent of open source and Drupal itself, I was a little bit sad about it, but not really surprised. So I kind of went and tried to understand what are the actual characteristics of those products. One of those product is actually open source. One GPT, I didn't put it on the slide because it was only one out of the 4 that I tried, mentioned WordPress VIP as a viable headless, like no-code headless CMS, which I found a little bit funny. So I tried to understand what are the criteria and aspects that makes it that Drupal is not on the map as viable options from the outside, from someone that tries to pick a solution without any preconcept. So I bought into those key aspects when we're looking at picking an actual headless CMS solution. One of the major aspects is like, is it headless first? And of course, for Drupal, it's kind of complex because Drupal is not a headless first solution. Actually, it actually came as an afterthought. It's more like an add-on, additional layer, and you can feel it because if you start building complex solution, you're gonna have to try to tame down the beast, like try to make it so it doesn't expose too much stuff because it wasn't meant to be a headless CMS. Content modeling, content governance, like all those aspects that are generic for any CMS. Integration capabilities, licensing. Sometimes open source is actually more complex to sell to organizations. Hosting related to that, is it a SaaS offering, that kind of thing? Does it provide visual editing? What APIs it provides? Is it friendly for the developers? And does it have AI capabilities? Yes, it seems like it comes back a lot, but Drupal has, right now, extensive AI capabilities. So I thought that there are really major points on which I think we could focus as a community to put Drupal on the map as a viable headless CMS solution. Promoting it as a like we're never going to pretend that Drupal is headless first, but maybe there's a way in the same in the vein of what we did with Drupal CMS to kind of package it up as a product that's actually ready to consume as a headless first CMS. The licensing aspect, I'm not saying it's an issue. I'm saying it's actually on the plus side of things. It's something we can use to promote the solution even more, because if we go back to that list, there's only one of those that is actually open source. And the developer friendliness, I think, is a key aspect on which we can work, because even if it looks easy, this is like that's the navigation. It's the menu that you're going to have on the left side of the screen if you go to the next Drupal project documentation. So like all the steps you have to do to actually end up with a Drupal instance that works. It's not hard to do, but it's not it doesn't look like a turnkey solution for someone that's just evaluating options, right? It's not as easy as just going and opening an account on the content pool. So what I mean by that is like something that is like that would be as easy as deploying Drupal CMS and just start tinkering with the solution. So what I want to discuss basically right now that we make huge progress, we're building Experience Builder, we have Drupal CMS, is how maybe we can add something that's easier to enable, and like that's just basically a markup, but when, for example, we install Drupal CMS, maybe there might be a headless option that we can turn on. So we'll see. Maybe it's not a good idea to divert Drupal CMS from its use, so maybe what we should do is having a different flavor Drupal CMS that's basically going to be headless, and you pick the feature you want as if it was Drupal CMS. That's it. That's the extent of what I think the state of decoupled Drupal and the headless CMS world is. And thank you for attending, and if you have a question for me, I'm happy to answer it. Do we want to recall the questions, maybe? Who has the microphone? And
Sure, we could just repeat them, too.
Thanks again for that great presentation. My question would be for a team that's going to be embarking on their first decoupled project. What are some stumbling blocks you could call out, things that a new team would typically run into and have to do some learning on their first project?
I would say try to identify what they need to learn based on the existing skills. If it's a seasoned team, like a seasoned Drupal development team, they're going to have to learn React or Vue.js, and I mean how it's different from an actual like page-based CMS experience. But if it's the opposite, like you have a team that possesses like more front-end stack skills, so they're JavaScript or TypeScript developers, the first thing to learn is probably how Drupal see content, how the content is modeled inside a Drupal CMS, such the concepts of entities and fields and reference between entities, so that they can hit the road more easily when they're going to start interacting with JSON API or GraphQL, but they're going to understand why, for example, there are 3 layers of indirection from a node to the actual URL of an image when you want to display it. So I would say start by identifying where they're coming from, and if they need to learn more about the front-end side or the back-end side.
You were talking about Planned Parenthood and security issues. In terms of using Drupal, using the headless model as a security thing, are you able to like completely lock the Drupal site off the internet that way? Maybe on a local area network or VPN or something?
So that's exactly one of the major upsides. So I would say typically you're going to be able to almost completely shield it from the internet. You might need to keep, let's say, the JSON API endpoint open and all the /site/default/files prefix open so that medias can be fetched. But you can pretty much lock down all the rest, so from a specific IP address that requires a VPN, all that kind of things. But you could go further and make sure that your front end never need to rely on the actual JSON API endpoint because everything's static. You don't have like search features or e-commerce or whatever. So you can actually extract everything. But then you need to figure out a solution for extracting all the medias or proxy them, whatever.
Maybe like an AWS.
Yeah, I was going to say the easiest route the easiest solution for me would be to have, so you're going to have your main domain for the front end, you're going to have a different domain for what's available to the front end on the Drupal side, and then a third domain that is what the content editor accesses. So that domain is fully available, but it's restricted to specific country or specific IP address or requires a VPN. And the second one has, as I said, just access to media and the API, and you can slap a Cloudflare or that kind of thing in front of that to kind of shield it a little bit more. And then you have your front end on a different domain.
I'm thinking about the things that get lost when you decide to decouple Drupal. And to be fair, some of those things get lost when people start building custom themes. I see that all the time. But some of the things I'm thinking of are accessibility, which is one of the core gates, usability, another of the core gates. A lot of Drupal's caching system, which is really good, is tied to render arrays. So how do you get those back, or can you still use some of those features in a decoupled architecture?
I would say those are, from that specific standpoint, one of the major pain points, if you will. There's accessibility, that's true, but as you said, I mean, if the team would have been developing a brand new theme, they would have taken that into account anyway. So usually that's something that either the team is cognizant of those aspects and they're going to respect them, or otherwise it's going to be broken anyway. But there's still more to do, quote unquote, unless you start with an existing set of ready-to-go components on the React side of things that happens to be already accessible, and so you're gonna have to actually have to do more work than what Drupal provides out of the box, if you were to use one of the default themes, basically. The other aspect is SEO, and SEO-related metadata, basically the meta tags module. There's a need to do some wiring up of all the meta information that are going to be set around the content, to retrieve them and put them in the right place on the actual markup on the front-end side of things, which Drupal does for you for free, and you're going to have to find a way to extract that information because it's all tokens and rendering the tokens and all that kind of things. I still think there's a probably 5-year-old issue open on the meta tag modules about how do we expose that through JSON API. So that's still requires some patch. And caching. So, of course, because you're removing the front end, you're losing all the render array niceties, but you still keep everything that's all the caching aspects of the entity layer. So when you request data from the JSON API endpoint, it leverages the Drupal caching. So when you request an entity through JSON API, if it was already requested 10 seconds ago and no one changed the entity, you just receive a cached result. It doesn't load anything from the database.
So we're up on time.
There was a last question. Can we take it?
Oh, sure.
This would be a quick one. Do you have any recommendations for basically asset image CDNs? Because I think using CMS is built-in images. I think using third-party CDNs entirely for assets, I prefer. So do you have anything that you recommend for the decoupled approach?
So I don't know if I can recommend any particular product. I mean, I'm used to basically, I'm really used to Cloudflare and AWS CloudFront, but I think that basically there's going to be two routes. It's either you just add a, let's say, CDN, a caching layer on top of your Drupal instance, which means it's going to be transparently cached, and like retrieved the first time and then cached, or you implement some kind of a like asset push to a different location, and that means that can actually be even an S3 bucket, but you're going to have to figure out if there's an existing solution in terms of modules, so that where content gets created or altered, Drupal's going to push the right assets to that S3, and then you're going to need a logic to kind of swap the URLs of the media, and it's completely doable. I do think that for small size projects, it's probably better to have some kind of transparent HTTP proxying, caching using a CDN in front of Drupal. But like the key aspect is like, what image styles are you going to put on your CDN? If you do it, like you want to pre-push everything on a CDN, like do you need all the styles? Do you need just a handful? So you're going to have to think a little bit more thoroughly. Rather, you could have like a transparent way of doing things with a CDN. Basically.
Cool, thanks.
All right, thanks everyone. Kudos again for showing up at night.